Well, why don't we go ahead and get started? Let me welcome you all to the Woodrow Wilson Center, those here in the auditorium and the people watching on the web. We're just delighted to have you all gathered here. Those of you who are new to the Wilson Center, let me just give a word or two about its background. The Wilson Center is the living memorial to our 28th president. He was the only president in America's history to have had a Ph.D. In his era, he was, in fact, quite a prominent political scientist. He then, of course, went on to get into politics, governor of New Jersey, and a two-term president. And he often commented that the scholar and, in many ways, the policymaker were involved in complementary efforts. And when Congress decided they wanted to honor Woodrow Wilson, they decided against one more marble statue, one more monument, and instead created this living memorial that is created to bring together both sides of his life. The best thinkers about public policy along with the people who are making and influencing policy. And we have one of those Wilsonian types with us today. David Lynch, who really has been a very long time financial reporter and at the same time really has been quite a student of the financial system here and around the world. For many years, he was with USA Today, focusing on finance, opening their bureau in London, being the founding bureau chief in Beijing. He genuinely has a global perspective on life. He's recently been lured away by Bloomberg News, and I guess when you say the word Bloomberg, you have an idea that that may be an institution that has a good deal of resources. And his assignment now, and you'll see it when you read this book, his assignment now is really to look at that intersection of policy and politics. And certainly we are going to see that in spades here in the lame duck session and looking forward to the 112th Congress. Earlier, just to show how the breadth of David's experience, he was a reporter with the Orange County Register in Southern California, where he followed the aerospace industry, and particularly that period just after the Cold War, when there was an enormous, some would say, build down in the aerospace industry, and how Southern California and the industry itself reacted to it. In a sense, it was another kind of crisis that was, again, affecting an important part of the real economy. I just cannot strongly enough recommend When the Luck of the Irish Ran Out. It is just an absolute jewel of a book. And David has managed to weave together a tapestry of personalities, politics, and policy that lets you draw key lessons that really apply, I'm afraid, to us and a number of other countries by looking at specific individuals and how they succumbed almost to a hubristic moment. The other element that I found intriguing about the book is that he really has set it in the history and culture of Ireland. And he was confirming that he is, in fact, a son of the soil himself here, of Irish descent. And I can only say after reading this book, looking for the right sense of pleasure and surprise, I wanted to paraphrase Orphan Annie. He was a very popular cartoon character who was known for saying, leapin' lizards. And in this case, of course, I'd have to say, leapin' leprechauns. David, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Ken. Well, thanks very much, and thanks to all of you for coming out. This is, after almost 30 years as a professional journalist, this is my first book. Writing a book has always been a personal goal of mine, and so to have a chance to do this has really been a labor of love, which is not just a euphemism for saying small advance, although that might be true as well. But I'm grateful to you folks for your interest in coming out. I'm grateful to Kent Hughes, who hosted me here at the Wilson Center earlier this year as a public policy scholar, and really given the very compressed schedule that I was working on, I quite literally could not have done this book without the help and support of the Wilson Center, and so I really want to say a word of thanks to them. Ireland is in the midst of a tremendous crisis at the moment. We see it every day in the headlines. But I want to step back a little bit and talk about the story that I try to tell in the book, which is the story of Ireland's transformation over the past quarter century. And it's a change from a country that in the early to mid-'80s was poor, stagnant, and insecure to one that was rich, culturally vibrant, and at peace for the first time in generations, probably the peak of modern Irish historical experience. And then if the story had stopped there, it would have been a good news story. But as any fatalistic Irishman or Irishwoman could tell you, the minute things are going that well, there's the cliff is looming. And sure enough, the story of the last decade has been one of squandering much of what had been gained during the first half of this period, although not all of it. At bottom, more than economic statistics or even cultural milestones, to me, the story I try to tell is one of a comprehensive remaking of what it means to be Irish, of Irish identity. The Irish are a people, after all, that Oscar Wilde once referred to memorably as brilliant failures, which I think sort of encapsulates the duality that's always been there for the Irish. Tremendous gifts, and yet not a heck of a lot to show for it up until very recently. Now, for me, this is a story that, as Kent suggested, is both one of personal interest and professional interest. I'm a fifth-generation Irish-American. My Lynch ancestors came over on the SS Liverpool, and I found a picture of it on the internet, believe it or not. In the early 1860s, they had what I think would be sort of the typical 19th century immigrant experience, settling in Holyoke, Massachusetts. My relatives worked in the paper mills in Holyoke along the Connecticut River there, worked as garbage men, stonemasons, delivered the mail. Very basic 19th century, typical American immigrant experience. And I was conscious of my Irish heritage growing up, not overly so, but conscious of it. And finally, in the late 80s, got interested in researching the family history, the genealogy, and my dad and I took that on as a family project for a few years, and literally were able to go back and find the specific plot of land where the Lynches had lived in the middle of the 19th century. But what made it of more professional interest was I was based in London in the latter part of the 1990s, covered the peace process in Northern Ireland, which led up to the Good Friday Agreement in 1998. I had a chance to write about and witness the Celtic Tiger economy of the Republic of Ireland when it was really at its zenith in the late 90s. And I thought at the time, there's a heck of a story to tell here of how Ireland was transformed and was being transformed. And for various reasons, I never got around to it. I went off to China, did other things, came back to the States about 5 years ago, and have been writing about the global economy ever since. And certainly for the past couple of years, that's been a story of crisis after crisis, and it made Ireland newly relevant in my work and gave me a chance, I think, to come back on the story that I'd had a great deal of interest in and affection for. But I think to really appreciate the extent of the transformation that I'm talking about and that I try to chronicle in the book, you need to go back to where I start the story in 1984 and take a look at just what Ireland was like at that time. And it was a pretty bleak period. On the economic front, the economy was an absolute mess. Unemployment of 18.5%. A debt to GDP ratio of 130%, really on a par with some countries in Africa, like Ethiopia. The Irish were literally on the verge, they feared, of having the IMF come in and impose an economic solution on them because they had so badly mismanaged the economy. Huge budget deficit. 1 in 3 people receiving some form of state aid. emigration, perhaps most tragically, emigration, which had long been a central part of the Irish experience, was really accepted as the natural way of life. If you were parents and you raised your kids and they were lucky enough to get a university degree, it was almost certain that they would have to leave the country to find work. One of the characters that I use in the book, and I try to tell this story through 5 personal stories, 3 of whom are prominent: the Bertie Ahern, the 3-time elected Taoiseach or Prime Minister of Ireland; Sean Fitzpatrick, the head of Anglo-Irish Bank, which is the rogue bank that ultimately pulls the economy and the public finances into the ditch; Roddy Doyle, the accomplished novelist, prize-winning novelist who has a new book out this year; and then 2 sort of every man or every woman characters, one of whom, Jack Byrne, graduates from college in 1983. He's got a degree in information technology. He, along with all but one other person in his graduating class, has to emigrate to find work. And that was the common, inevitable experience of the day, but really tragic as a marker of just how much, after 6 decades of independence, how independent Ireland had really failed. Socially, it was a very stagnant environment. The influence of the Catholic Church was pervasive. It was a near theocratic sort of regime. You couldn't buy a condom in a store. You needed a prescription from a doctor. You couldn't get a divorce. It was a very it was a society really where there were sort of 2 realities. There was the actual reality of life as we all know it in any society, where things go wrong, relationships go wrong, things happen that shouldn't happen. And then there was the pretense, which was the reality that people tried to maintain for the society at large. And that was a world in which no marriages were unhappy, no one had sex outside of marriage, there were no gay people. It was a sort of traditional, rural idyll, and it didn't really exist. And periodically there were signs of the actual reality forcing its way to the surface. And I tell a few of these stories in the book, but one that stuck with me was the story of this 15-year-old girl, Ann Lovett, who in 1984 became pregnant, hid her pregnancy from people in the village that she lived in the center of Ireland, wore loose-fitting clothes for several months, although some people said that folks suspected. Everyone pretended not to see. And finally, on the day that it was time to give birth, she went behind St. Mary's Church, laid down on a gravestone. It was a cold, sort of wet winter day. She gave birth to a baby who was born stillborn, and she lay there bleeding in the churchyard until she was found several hours later, taken to the hospital, and ultimately died. And this was a real scandal for obvious reasons in the Ireland of the day, but it also triggered something in Irish society. And Gay Byrne, who was then and for years one of Ireland's most prominent entertainers, sort of a cross between a Larry King and a Johnny Carson, and he had a radio call-in program, and women, he staged a 2-hour reading of letters that he had received from women all over Ireland who wrote in with similar experiences that they'd had or their relatives had had, similar tales of hidden pregnancies, of things in society that people didn't want to acknowledge. And for 2 hours, Gay Byrne read these letters aloud, and it was a real marker in Irish society. It signaled that things were changing, and this society of pretense was beginning to rupture. Now, along with a failed economy and a stagnant society, Ireland at the time was also living in the shadow of terrorist violence in the north. You know, Belfast, just a couple hours drive away from Dublin, and in the early 80s, the conflict in the north seemed as intractable and as violent as ever. And that was really what people outside of Ireland associated with the island. That was, along with John Wayne's The Quiet Man, when people thought of Ireland, they thought of Belfast. And politicians in the Republic knew that. They would talk about that. Dick Spring, who was a prominent figure in the Labour Party, told me that he had married an American woman, and he said at any time he would see his in-laws, they would always express concern about his wife. Were events in the news? Was she safe? How close were they to Belfast? And of course, the Springs lived in County Kerry, down in the southwest part of the island. They couldn't have been farther away from Belfast. But that's what people knew of Ireland. And the Irish brand, if you will, at the time was one of a country that was focused more on the past than on the future. This was a country looking backwards economically, looking backwards socially at a world that really no longer existed, and looking backward at nationalistic conflicts that were really decades old. And so as of the mid-1980s, there was substantial talk and belief that after 6 decades, independent Ireland was really a failure. There was not much to show for it. Now, that all began to change, though, and we wouldn't have much of a story if it hadn't changed. The real dividing point was in 1987, when a new government came in, the Fianna Fáil government, led by Charles Haughey, who himself is quite a character. I describe him in the book as a cross between the charisma of a Caesar and the ethics of a mob boss. Haughey was someone who, on a government salary, had somehow managed to accumulate sufficient wealth to have shirts custom tailored in Paris, to own an 18th century estate north of Dublin, to have racehorses, and to somehow even own a small island, a private island off the coast of Kerry. So this was someone who had done quite well for himself. Now, in '87, Haughey had campaigned against the suggestion that radical change was needed in the Irish economy. The then Fine Gael government said, look, this budget's out of control, we've got to cut, we've got to bring our finances into line, or the ship of state is going down. And Haughey's campaign had focused on, cuts will hurt the sick, the poor, and the elderly. And he had used that line like a club to beat Fine Gael all the way through the election. He won the election on that campaign of no cuts. And 5 minutes after taking office, he embraced the cuts that Fine Gael had advocated and went even a little bit beyond that. Now, this was a critical step. They were able, and Fine Gael could have used it to simply make Haughey's life miserable, but the Fine Gael leaders, to their credit, saw that there was no other way forward for Ireland but to cut and but to retrench. And so you had this rare moment of cross-party consensus that enabled Ireland to make the cuts that were needed to get the public finances into control. That brought interest rates down. They were double digits at the time, very different environment from today, which is important. But the cuts brought interest rates down, coupled with the devaluation of the currency in '86 and again in '92. That helped spur exports. The country made a determined effort, the government at the time made a determined effort to attract money from abroad, particularly from the United States, in the form of foreign direct investment. So you had companies like Intel and Gateway and Microsoft and Citigroup flooding into the country to take advantage of very low corporate tax rates and to use Ireland as a launching point to enter the single European market. Remember, we're in the late 80s now, so the European project is focused on EC 92, which will create that single European market by 92. American companies and others are worried that this could become a fortress Europe, that they'll be shut out, so they want to get inside fortress Europe. Ireland offers them a platform to do that. So that's how things begin to change. It was really sort of a multi-part formula, if you will, of public finances devaluation, a supportive global environment where the economy globally is growing, so Ireland has someone to sell to, and also critically money from the European Union in the form of infrastructure funds that allow Ireland to address some of its chronic shortcomings in roads and telecom, just to name a couple. Now, the result of all this, it's a dramatic change, and the result of it by the late 1990s is really a different country. You've got an economy that's growing at 8, 9, 10% a year, year after year. Unemployment, which has been the habitual problem for Ireland, is finally starting to come down from 15, 16% down towards single digits, although not quite there yet. Culturally, and this I think indicates the interrelationship among all these different kinds of change. I was telling someone the other day, when I started this book, I was thinking about the economic, cultural, and political evolution as sort of three parallel but concurrent phenomenon. And the more I got into it, the more I began to recognize that these really were all interrelated. The economic change and achievement fed a sense of cultural self-confidence that enabled some of Ireland's stars to get better noticed and better appreciated. That affected the forms of cultural expression, even through something as prosaic as river dance, which I think, for the first time in quite some time, made being Irish sexy. The Irish had been called a lot of things over the years, and I think I can say this as an Irish American. I'm not sure sexy was really ever one of them until Riverdance came along. Those two changes of the economic and the cultural then fed into the peace process in the North, because for the longest time, one of the concerns, to put it mildly, that Unionists in Northern Ireland had about any sort of agreement with the South, any sort of prospect, however distant, of a united Ireland, was of the type of society that the Republic was. Unionists saw themselves as part of the British Empire, part of this industrial state that was accomplished and had a high standard of living, that was modern and secular, and they looked at the Republic and they saw a backward, rural, priest-ridden enclave that they wanted no part of. It was harder to make that case as the Republic began to change through the 1990s. As the Republic became ultimately wealthier on a per capita basis than the United Kingdom, it was hard to see the Republic as a rural, backward state. As the fetters of Catholicism, traditional Catholicism, began to fall away and the society became more vibrant, more modern, for lack of a better word, it was hard to have legitimate fears of being swallowed up by a Catholic theocracy. So all these things began to work together. And I said at the outset that this story is really one of an overhaul or a remaking of Irish identity. And you saw that in the late 90s as attitudes, traditional, venerable attitudes towards wealth, towards nationalism, towards some of the most intimate aspects of family life, all began to change. Wealth had, for one example, had long been something in the Irish experience that the British and the Protestants had, and the Irish and the Catholics lacked. And the form, by the late 19th century, there were commentators writing that the form of Catholicism that had taken root in Ireland was almost hostile to the accumulation of wealth, and that promulgated a view of material riches as something, if not sinful, not to be coveted, and that your reward for living a good life now would come in the next life. The British Protestants had a very different view of wealth. To them, it was sort of a running scorecard of how God saw the life you were leading. So if you were accumulating things in this life, you must be doing something right in the eyes of the deity. So it was a very different way of looking at things. Now, again, as I said at the beginning, if we had ended the story at this point, it would have been a happier experience for the Irish. They had really emerged by the late 90s, and they weren't shy about saying this, as a model for other small economies on the periphery of larger countries. Countries from Colombia to Croatia, Latvia, all over the world would send delegations to Dublin of the Celtic Tiger era for suggestions to try and find out what was the secret Irish recipe for perpetual prosperity. But that secret recipe really didn't exist, and it began to go badly off the rails as we got past the turn of the century and around the time of the 9/11 attacks and the global recession that followed. That really marks the break between the two periods. The first period of genuine export-oriented prosperity, where Ireland had focused on being competitive and had capitalized on its productivity and its advantages and its low corporate tax rate to sell real products to real customers outside of the country. That was the first period, and then with the break after 2001, Ireland increasingly begins to veer into a housing and credit bubble larger even than that we've suffered here in the United States. It was if you ask the question, well, how did that happen? Who's to blame for this? There's, as in the U.S. experience, there's plenty of blame to go around. First and foremost, it's a case of reckless banks in Ireland, aided by a weak regulator and a complicit political class. The banks in Ireland, particularly over the period 2003 to 2007, increasingly became dependent upon global wholesale markets where they could borrow at very low interest rates, accumulate the funds, turn around, bring them into Ireland, and lend them on to property developers, construction companies who were throwing up housing estates hand over fist. Between 2003 and 2007, in fact, the Irish banks imported into the country an amount of money equal to half of the GDP. So think about that in American terms. It would be as if a river of $7 trillion was flowing into the American economy. So this is a massive flow of money into Ireland that, unlike the U.S. experience, where, remember, our financial crisis, it comes down largely to financial products that are sophisticated, that are complex, that were meant to offload risk, but in fact augmented it, and that were often not particularly well understood, not just by the average person or journalists or commentators, but weren't very well understood by the people selling these products. That was the U.S. experience. In Ireland, it was not nearly that complicated. The Irish banks had a plain vanilla banking crisis. They made dumb loans to people who couldn't pay them back. And it's no more complicated than that. They, thanks to Ireland's joining the euro, they had access to an amount of money, global capital flows that they'd never had access to before at very low interest rates, and they turned around and made loans to property developers based on almost nothing. By the end of the boom, in fact, they were making loans of 100% of value on agricultural land that hadn't even been zoned for development. That land now is worth 10, maybe 30% of what the loan value was, so the banks are underwater on all of those things. And it was just a basic banking failure. After the fact now, the National Asset Management Agency, which is buying these bad loans from the banks to try and clear their balance sheet and allow them to get back to lending, they've gone in to look at the documentation for these loans, and it's astonishing how badly these loans were handled. In many cases, if two borrowers came in together to borrow the money, both their names, both their signatures should be on the documents, right? So if the loan isn't repaid, the bank can come after both of them for the money. Often there'd be two names on the paperwork, but only one signature. Or the bank would think it had clear title to the land, but turn out that actually there were two or three other contestants. So when the loan goes bad, they can't even chase anyone for the money. So it's really just an appalling failure of bank management, corporate governance, and the like. Now, the result of all this, because the banks had so much money and were lending year after year into this increasingly manic environment, was you had a housing bubble that by some metrics was perhaps 2 times that of the United States, maybe 3 times. The Federal Reserve Bank in San Francisco, in fact, has a chart that over one period of time where U.S. housing prices rose, real after inflation housing prices rose by something in the order of 52, 53%. In Ireland, they rose 172%. So this is really just an incredible bubble. And when it bursts, the resulting economic downturn is commensurately greater than it's been here in the United States. From peak to trough, our fall of industrial output was something like 7%, and we know how painful that's been here in the United States. In Ireland, it's been 17%. Unemployment from a low of 3.7 has shot up to almost 14%. So it's just a huge catastrophe for Ireland. And the one statistic that I think may bring it home for an American audience is that the cost of the banking bailout in Ireland, the cost of recapitalizing these banks, trying to clean up their balance sheet, buying the troubled loans from them so that they can get back into the business of banking, the cost of that measured against the size of the Irish economy would be equivalent to 5 or 6 TARP programs here in the United States. And think of how controversial TARP has been, how much political fallout there's been from the notion of this one $700 billion bank bailout that the U.S. may even break even on. Imagine doing that 6 times over, and you've got a window into the Irish experience. Now, we worry here about the prospect of a lost decade. The Irish may be facing a lost 2 decades. There's been some statistics that have indicated that it may be 2021 or later before Ireland gets back to its 2007 level of output. Again, the extent of the bank bailout is enormous. The public deficit now that they're trying to grapple with, requiring cuts year after year that would be difficult to imagine the U.S. political system handling. Right now, Ireland is on the verge of a new budget that's going to involve €6 billion in cuts. That's roughly a 10% cut in government spending after already 2 or 3 earlier budgets of retrenchment. Imagine cutting the U.S. government budget by $300 billion this year. It'd be like cutting the Pentagon in half, almost. That's what Ireland is going through. They've had a couple of smaller cuts in the last couple of years, this massive one this year, and another $9 billion after this year yet to come. So one of the questions is, does political stability hold through this process? Now, it's easy and it's tempting as a writer to make this a full circle, to say, well, Ireland started down here in 1984, rose like Icarus to the peak, and has now come back to that bad place of high unemployment, high immigration, despair, and lack of a future. And some people have suggested that the Celtic Tiger was all just a mirage. It was all phony prosperity. There was nothing real about it. There's a lot of anger in Ireland today, much of it justifiable anger, at the notion that people have been hoodwinked by the political elites, by the business elites, and that it was all just a mirage. I don't think it all was a mirage, which is not to underestimate by any stretch the extent of the damage that the Irish have inflicted upon themselves, or the extent of the challenge that remains before them, which is massive. But Ireland today is a different place than it was before the Celtic Tiger, and much of the change has been good. The change is incomplete, in my view, and Ireland needs to complete the process of maturing as an independent country. But that's not impossible to imagine. You know, Ireland today, independent Ireland today, is only about as old as the United States was at the time of our great national trial, the Civil War. So it's easy for me to say as an outsider who's not suffering through the Irish experience, but countries go through terrible trials, and you can't let your focus on the current pain and disaster obscure either the achievements to date or the potential in the future. And I do think the Irish retain a lot of advantages that they can exploit going forward, and they have demonstrated, as I say in the subtitle, a certain amount of resilience over the years, and we can talk about that perhaps in the questions. But they are at a critical turning point as a nation. It's going to be impossible to simply reconstruct the Celtic Tiger formula that worked in the late 80s and the 90s. It's a different world now. Ireland's going to need a different strategy. And they're going to have to finally confront some long-deferred questions on the political side and the economic side to develop a new formula. And that still remains to be seen, how quickly they'll confront those issues and how successfully. But perhaps we can talk a little bit more about that in the questions.
That's great.
You
want to stay there for questions?
Sure.
Or? That's great. Why don't I give you your well-earned glass of water here?
Okay.
The generosity of the Wilson Center
knows
here
no
never
bounds.
stops. Well, let's open it up for questions. Please, the lady there in the back, if you could identify yourself and wait for the microphone.
I'm Mitzi Worth. I'm with the Naval Postgraduate School. Last weekend, I saw the film Inside Job, which exposes what I'm going to call all the corruption of white collar at the top political and economic level in this country. Sounds to me that you had the same problem in Ireland, and one of my questions is, does anybody ever get punished at the top for playing these games so they enrich themselves and really bring the rest down? And I guess the other question I have is, it's a little hard for me to see how Ireland, within its own borders, can get back to where it was, because we're now part of this global economy, and the question is, where's the work and what is the work?
Right. Two good questions. I'm tempted to say that the short answer to your first question in the Irish context is no. People generally don't get punished. And Fintan O'Toole, who's a very prominent Irish journalist and writer, social commentator, has written of a culture of impunity in Ireland, where people for years at elite levels of business and government have if not broken the law, well, in many cases have broken the law, and yet are never really brought to account. And that has been kind of a chronic problem in Irish society. There are those who see that as a legacy of the colonial experience, that and many have written about this, that the colonial experience for Ireland bred in people a view of authority as somehow fundamentally illegitimate, because going back a century or two, authority was illegitimate, and that the Irish have never really fully gotten on board with the idea that it's their country now, and they're making the rules, and the people enforcing the rules are them, and people need to follow the rules. There is a sense in which the Celtic Tiger era fostered a kind of crony capitalism where, after all, it is a very small country, and so everybody knows everybody else, particularly in the top levels of government and business. It's a very Dublin-centered economy, so you've got a small country with a small population, and all roads lead to Dublin, and these guys and gals all know each other, and they all work together, and it's, you watch my back and I watch yours. And one of the real wellsprings for the public anger now is the story of this guy, Sean Fitzpatrick, the head of Anglo-Irish Bank, and I tell his story in the book, because he had taken this really nothing bank from the 1980s. I think it started as a place you'd go to get a loan to buy a washing machine or a radio. And he built that through force of personality and charm and hard work and customer service into the third largest bank in the country, became fabulously profitable. And he personally sort of emerged as an emblem of what the Celtic Tiger was all about. Brash, arrogant, successful, didn't respect limits or bounds, and was all about, sort of the go-go era. And, that was great so far as it lasted, but then in the fall of 2008, after the Irish banks had to be guaranteed by the government in the wake of the Lehman Brothers bankruptcy, it was disclosed that Fitzpatrick had been taking personal loans from his bank every year for 8 years, large amounts of loans. I think at the peak it was over $170 million. And there's nothing in and of itself wrong with that, but he, at the end of each fiscal year, just before the auditors would come in, he'd borrow money from another bank, Irish Nationwide, pay off his debt to his own bank. So when the auditors came in and checked the books, there was no sign of any loan to Fitzpatrick, which would have had to be disclosed to investors because he was the CEO and later chairman. The auditors would leave, having verified that everything was fine. The minute they were out the door, he'd pay off the loan to Irish Nationwide by taking a new loan from Anglo-Irish, and this shell game went on year after year. And when that was disclosed at the end of 2008, when people were already livid over the fact that taxpayers were being called upon to bail out the banks, when it was disclosed that this was how Anglo-Irish had operated, and then when it appeared that the regulator had known about this and had done nothing, people were just incandescent with rage. And so Fitzpatrick has really become public enemy number one, to the extent, again, imagine a small country, everybody knows everybody else. He almost literally cannot show his face in public. I interviewed him in Boston and in Dublin, and when we met in Dublin, it was this sort of furtive meeting where we met down by the water at a condo that he owned, and we sort of skulked around and quickly got inside where no one could see us, and I interviewed him in this utterly empty building in an empty room for 2.5 hours, and it was just bizarre to see this former captain of finance reduced to sneaking around town. And he still faces several investigations which may yet result in charges. He was arrested and detained overnight back in March for questioning, but to date no charges have been filed. And I'm sorry, the second question was how Ireland can come back. Ireland as a small country is dependent upon a global environment to sort of raise it up. It can't do it all on its own the way a larger economy like Germany can, and that's just a fact of life. And sometimes I think over the years Irish leaders have maybe subconsciously used that fact as an excuse for not minding the store. In other words, it's sort of no matter what we do, it's out of our hands. And that led to some of the policy failures that we've seen over the past decade or two. But what hasn't really been done is a real focus on the indigenous Irish businesses to develop homegrown companies that can grow jobs. That's not going to be the whole answer, but the Irish have been talking about that for 2 decades because they didn't see foreign direct investment and the Intels and the gateways as sort of the be-all and end-all. It was important and it was a great way to get started, but the expectation was always that these companies would spread management ability and spread entrepreneurship throughout the wider economy, and that hasn't really happened to the extent that I think they had anticipated.
Lady here. Again, be sure to introduce yourself.
Oh, thank you. I'm Deborah Miller. I'm going to be teaching a course at George Mason at the School of Public Policy in the spring on globalization and international financial institutions and the financial crisis. So your talk was very interesting to me, and I thought it was a story well told, too. I think it was particularly interesting because it's interesting to hear you talk about what happened in Ireland and contrast that to what happened in other countries. Mm-hmm. Just have one comment, which is that I think that Ireland, especially in 1987, in the mid-1980s, changed a lot because of its accession to the European community. Mm-hmm. I know that you talked about how domestic policies changed things, but the social environment that you talked about that existed before the 1980s had to change as a result of joining the European Commission. Reproductive laws changed, divorce laws changed. There were a whole series of changes, and I think that direct foreign investment became something that really Ireland could really use as a way to grow because Ireland had joined the community. Mm-hmm. So I think it was really more than domestic policies. I think it was joining the community that was a big variable. So I just point that out. And on Ireland and Ireland's current financial crisis, I think Ireland really was very much. I think although Ireland's experience was a little difficult, it was a little different. I think in some ways it was very, very typical of what happened in other countries too. And I just was listening to you and thinking of Nouriel Roubini's book. Mm-hmm. And I think that Ireland's experience is typical in certain ways, different in certain ways, typical in others. So I just point that out.
Right. I would just say a couple of things. The European community has been very important, obviously, but Ireland joined in the early 70s, and as late as 1986 had a referendum on divorce where people voted to uphold the prohibition. So there was, it wasn't until 1995, 2 decades after they joined, that divorce became legal in a second referendum, and that was by the skin of its teeth. I mean, in the 95 vote, again, I'm getting older, but 1995 doesn't seem that long ago, and it was by the skin of its teeth that the Yes campaign got that through. The second thing I would say is that I think you're right that all of these crises sort of bear a certain amount of similarities. I think of them as these bubble phenomenon, and we've had them for centuries now, and I think we're going to have them forever. I just think it's something in the human nature that it's impossible to ever stamp out, to ever eradicate. There's something where it's the madness of crowds, but so they share that common element that goes back to the Dutch and tulips, but there were unique features, characteristics of the Irish case, and I think you could say the same about Iceland and the U.S. and elsewhere. It's that old line about happy families are all different or all the same, but unhappy families are right. It's the same. These are unhappy economies, and in the Irish case, there are two that I think are important, which is one, the sort of central role of land. Now you could say, well, there was a housing bubble in the United States too, but in Ireland, the critical goes beyond psychological. It's something innate in the Irish character that has built up over centuries, where land, and it goes back to the colonial experience, goes back to the land wars in the 19th century, where owning the land is critical because of the history of dispossession and eviction and forced emigration. To own the land has always been something that the Irish have focused on above all else. And you see it, you can differentiate between, say, the Irish and the Germans, where German people will rent property. They'll rent apartments. It's perfectly natural and normal to rent. In Ireland, renting is seen as just throwing money away. And home ownership rates, where, in this country, we're in the low 60s, maybe got up to 65% when we were giving money away through subprime, but low 60s is sort of the norm here. In Ireland, it's 80, and has been 80 for some time. So land, the centrality of that, I would say, has historical roots. And the second is this characteristic I mentioned earlier about sort of winking at the rules. The Irish have an expression for it. It's called the cute whore, spelled H-O-O-R, which is somebody who gets away with something. And you see him or her getting away with it, and you respect them for getting away with it. Bertie Ahern would be seen that way early on, I think. And a lot of politicians. I mean, there's one famous case, Michael Lowry, who was exposed years ago as a tax cheat and having accepted a bribe from, effectively a bribe from a prominent businessman who had paid for a $500,000 addition to his house. Now, if somebody were exposed, a politician were exposed on the front page of the Washington Post as having had a prominent American businessman build him a house, that'd probably be the end of his career. This is not the case in Ireland. Not only has Lowry's career not ended, he's been reelected 3 times since then as the highest vote getter in the constituency, and he sits in Parliament to this day. And it's because of some specific features of the Irish political system, which is a very transactional arrangement. Here, if I want my street plowed, my street never gets plowed. I live at the top end of a cul-de-sac in Virginia, and so my street never gets plowed when we get snow. If I want it plowed, I've got to go find the local city councilor and jawbone them. I'm not going to call my congressman. I'm not going to call Tim Geithner. But in Ireland, if you want something done, you go to your local member of parliament, and you expect them to do things for you, and that's the nature of the game there. So it's a very different system.
The gentleman in the back, and then the gentleman here.
Henry Farrell, Woodrow Wilson Centre Fellow and Irish expatriate. Back to the European Union dimension. In what ways is the European Union and membership affecting the ways in which Ireland is responding? And here I'm thinking particularly of the frequent talk that you hear among Irish people about and among commentators in the Financial Times, effectively suggesting, for example, that the refusal of Ireland to get rid of a lot of the debt that the banks have accumulated, to effectively repudiate it, has a lot to do with the fact that the banks who are owed this money are German and French, and that Ireland is basically dependent upon the European Central Bank. Is that something where, this is a topic of rumour and discussion, but I don't know whether there's any fire behind that smoke? And secondly, I guess, you talked about a culture of impunity among Irish politicians, which I think is absolutely right. To what extent is there a culture of impunity among American pundits and commentators who use the Irish Celtic Tiger economy for a period of a decade and a half to belabour continental Europeans, saying that Ireland was the way forward, that this sort of efficient, low-tax, entrepreneurial sort of way of doing things was the sort of example that should be chosen, and now very clearly this has ended in disaster. But I haven't seen, for example, Tom Friedman, who's somebody who had a particularly hideous article in the New York Times called "The Way of the Leprechaun" on this topic. He hasn't been revisiting these thoughts in any public forum, to my knowledge.
Well, the first thing I want to say is that I was very proud of myself. I managed to get through the entire book with not a single reference to leprechauns, green beers, or anything else culturally hideous. But no, those are two good questions. I mean, look, there is a broader culture of impunity in the pundocracy that has nothing to do with Ireland and has everything to do with being a pundit, which is, you can go on television today and predict anything, and when it doesn't come to pass, you're never held to account, which is what these folks do day after day. But you're right. I think there was a sense of self-validation in that, I think a lot of people in the United States, and I'd say I was probably guilty of it in the late 90s myself when I first, I hope I'm not still guilty of it, but when I first would have looked at Ireland at the time in the late 90s, I think it was natural to, as an American, to look at it and see, aha, well, they're succeeding because they're following the American playbook. They've got weaker unions now and privatization and low taxes, and they're not going the continental route. And look, they've been rewarded by the markets with success, and that's because they're smart enough to follow our way of doing things. That argument doesn't look quite so compelling now. I do think that, and maybe this is off to the side a bit, but one thing I thought was interesting in Ireland in looking at this period was this question of Boston or Berlin that comes up. Did Ireland want to go? And Mary Harney gave a famous speech, I think it was in 2000, and talk about tempting fate, but she said, they say we have to make this choice between, and now I'm paraphrasing, choose between sort of the American economic model or the European model of social inclusion and social safety net, but we haven't made that choice. We've gone effectively the American route, she said, and have we had to give up our social protections? Have we had to cut health and education spending? No, not at all. Well, she couldn't give that speech today, of course, because now that choice is being forced upon Ireland. Now, to try and address your first question, I haven't looked at the BIS data in terms of who the Irish banks would have owed the money to. So I can't sort of specifically answer how much of it was German and French banks. I think I've seen the same arguments that you've seen. Ireland now, of course, is in a position where it's become very dependent upon the ECB funding to support its bonds because the yields are inching towards 8%. I think they're now at the highest level they've been since Ireland joined the euro. The insurance, the cost of insuring Irish debt, the technical vehicle is a credit default swap, but the cost of buying that insurance has skyrocketed just in the last couple of months as investors are beginning to take quite seriously the prospect that Ireland might default on its debt. But I can't give you a specific answer. I'm sorry.
Brian Kane, Computer and Communications Industry Association. I wondered if there's been any revisiting of the basic business model of Ireland as a low-tax platform for entry into Europe. And I'm thinking in particular of not of just low tax, but no tax in the case of intellectual property royalties, which is kind of an anomaly of the way that intellectual property income is treated, not attributed to the source of the benefit, but to actually where it is received. Any rethinking on any level there?
Well, there's the rethinking that I think is sort of most acute and problematic from the Irish perspective is that one of the EU commissioners said, I think today or yesterday, that in the event that Ireland does need to tap the European Stabilization Fund for support at some point, and that's not an immediate prospect because unlike Greece, Ireland is still liquid for a few more months. Ireland isn't out of money the way the Greeks were almost out of money in May. So Ireland's pre-funded until I think June of next year. But if it comes to pass that we get into early next year and the markets have just run away with things and Ireland has to tap the EU IMF bailout fund, that's not going to be free money, apart from the interest that the Irish would have to pay on it. Part of the quid pro quo is almost certainly going to be some adjustment in Ireland's very low tax rate, because the other countries in the EU have always sort of resented that, and the EU commissioner said, again, either today or yesterday, that Ireland's status is Ireland just can't continue indefinitely as a low-tax economy. That's not going to work, and that does put at issue that whole original formulation, or Celtic Tiger recipe, I guess.
The distinguished gentleman in the fourth row.
Hi, David Klaus with Wilson Center on the Hill. I want to thank you here at the Wilson Center. I want to thank you for absolutely superb presentation. I think you may have missed your calling if you were writing in journals as opposed to giving presentations like this. Your, as you were giving your talk, I wrote down a number of the things you talked about that really created the productivity for the Irish economy during the boom, and it had things like let's adjust our currency and encourage for direct investment and low tax rates and infrastructure development with roads and telecom and export-oriented productivity. And it sounds a heck of a lot like all of the sorts of things that I heard debated here in the United States and during the election as ways in which we're going to put the U.S. economy back together. My question is, having now looked with some intensity, a great deal of intensity at the Irish experience and sort of what worked and what in the remains of what doesn't seem to be working, what may still be working, and your experience around the world and other bureaus and stuff, sort of some thoughts about, if you take two steps back and maybe, share your thoughts with regard to the U.S. economy and other economies about what you think really seems to encourage real growth and real productivity and has some lasting, some lasting value as ways in which governments in this global economy can actually create jobs, build economy, build economic growth. If you can maybe share some thoughts on that.
Yeah, I'm not sure I have any sort of unique competence in that area. To be honest, I do think sort of one of the lessons from the current Irish situation, and it may be a little off point for what you've asked, but in terms of the need for growth, is that we're focused now, in part understandably, but also I think, in my personal opinion, a little bit myopically, on debt and the deficit. And so austerity has sort of emerged as the current conventional wisdom of the crowd. And I think as a general proposition, if you want a general lesson, I think beware of what everyone knows, right? Because it wasn't that long ago that everyone knew that we'd never had a nationwide decline in housing prices, and so we never would. And that was true right up until the minute it stopped being true, and then that bit of conventional wisdom was utterly useless. So now everybody knows we can't take on more debt, and we have to focus almost exclusively on reducing the deficit. And I would be wary of that focus, and I would look to the Irish experience and note that, for some time, the Irish, through most of the last year as I was researching this, were very proud to say, look, we're not Greece. We're not spending like, drunken sailors. We don't have an out-of-control system. We're taking the tough decisions to get our budget in line. We're cutting real money, real benefits, real pensions. We're doing the tough stuff that other people won't do. And they're about to do it again with another $6 billion cut next month. And yet the market sort of time and time again has pocketed those gains and said, thank you very much. I'm not impressed. And the whole logic behind the cuts is that the market would be impressed and would reward you with lower rates. And in fact, the opposite's happening, because the market isn't convinced that you, the Irish government, and you, the Irish public, are going to be able to sit still for this wave of pain that's coming and that's already here, but that is going to continue year after year. And the challenge is, of course, the balance between austerity and growth. And I think the problem both for the Irish and both for the United States, and again, it's kind of a natural human reaction is that people are searching for that almost cost-free way out of this crisis. They look at the austerity and they say, well, that's too tough. We don't want that. They look at something else. Well, we don't want to raise taxes. We don't want to do this. We don't want to do that. Everything's got a cost associated with it. And we're both the Irish and the United States, have driven ourselves into corners that are going to be very painful to get out of. And the question is, how do you apportion that pain through society, and how do you balance the austerity and growth so that you don't do so much on the austerity side that you get no growth, which feeds back into a bigger deficit, so all the sacrifice is for naught.
I want to exercise the prerogative of the chair with a question or two. When they faced this, when the Irish government faced the post-Lehman reality in which they really had to start rescuing the banks, did they look at the Swedish experience, which in retrospect seems to have worked out fairly well?
I don't know if they specifically looked at it. My guess would be events were moving so quickly in the days during which this guarantee was put together, which was literally finalized at a meeting that ended at 3:30 in the morning, that I would guess I'm not sure going the Swedish route would have really been within the government's remit. I think the issue, the bigger question at the time was whether all the banks should have been included in the guarantee, or whether, say, Anglo, which was the most reckless of a reckless industry, should have been nationalized then and there and euthanized, really. And then whether the guarantee should have extended to absolutely every bit of the banking system, or whether, say, bondholders should have been asked to bear some of the cost of effectively loaning money. Some of the bondholders of the banks were, equivalent to lending a guy who's already visibly drunk, lending him another $20 for his, at last call, so he can have a few more shots before he staggers out into the parking lot and hops into the car. And so there was an argument to doing that differently.
When the banks were borrowing short term, and I don't know how they were denominated, perhaps all in euros, or was it also in other hard currencies, but then lending long term to real estate, which was not a tradable good, it sounds an awful lot like...
Shouldn't have been a tradable good.
It looks an awful lot like what Thailand did.
Mm-hmm.
Did the IMF weigh in and say, didn't you see what happened to Thailand, and that kind of harsh advice?
Yeah, much of the borrowing was short term, and it was easy enough to roll this over during the good days. Right? Mm-hmm. So during, up until 2007, the rollovers were pretty routine, and along the way, and of course this is with the benefit of hindsight, so it's not entirely fair. But if you go back, as I did, and read the central bank reports and the IMF reports, the IMF's financial stability assessments, from the late 90s on, it's not hard to find warnings about the unsustainability of what was going on. Now, the warnings were the warnings were not as loud as they should have been. They were not as insistent as they should have been. But, I think coupled with common sense, which tells you that trees don't grow to the sky and that stock prices don't just move in one direction, there was enough there that people who, after all, get paid a lot of money to monitor these risks and pay attention to these things, should be held to account for missing them. Because, I cite a couple places in the book where the IMF expressed concern about the banks' approach to things and funding sources, because they had become so dependent. They had moved from a model where in the early days the banks did very basic banking. They took customer deposits in, turned around and loaned it on for a higher number and made money that way. And then as the opportunities started to become more numerous, they augmented the deposits with this wholesale borrowing on the global market. But then that borrowing itself began to take a larger and larger share, or begin to fund a larger and larger share of the loan portfolio, and they became dependent on it.
Just one last question about bankruptcy. Was there a bankruptcy option? And that, of course, in effect would have brought the bondholders possibly into risk, rather than, say, we chose a conservatorship with regard to Fannie and Freddie, so
Right.
that the bondholders were kept whole. Was bankruptcy a possibility which would have then shifted the pain elsewhere rather than exclusively to the Irish taxpayer?
Yeah, I think the problem was at the time, and this sort of misreading was not unknown in the United States experience either, both the banking executives and the government officials diagnosed the problem in the fall of 2008 as one of liquidity, not solvency. And the difference is that the view was that the Irish banks were fundamentally going concerns, that they had their assets outweighed their liabilities, they would have enough to meet their obligations, but their assets were tied up and they couldn't be accessed right now. They weren't liquid assets, as opposed to an insolvent institution is even if you could access all your assets, no matter whether they're tied up in long-term vehicles or not, you still couldn't meet your obligations. And that's Lehman Brothers. That's somebody who has to be put down. And so the diagnosis was, this is just a liquidity thing. I mean, Sean Fitzpatrick went on the radio a few days after the guarantee, and the guarantee at the time was something like, in a theoretical value, was something on the order of 2 times Irish GDP. So this was a huge guarantee and enormously controversial, as it should have been. And Sean Fitzpatrick went on the Marianne Finucane show, and she read him an emailed question from listeners who said, could you at least have the decency to say I'm sorry? And anybody with an ounce of, PR sense, even if he hadn't meant it, would have said, oh, yes, by the way, I am deeply sorry. And instead, Fitzpatrick said, well, actually, our problems are really because of this global crisis. They're not of our making, so I really can't with any sincerity say I'm sorry, but I will say thank you.
Do we have a last question? Yes, please. If you would just wait for the microphone and then please identify yourself.
Hi, David. I'm Laura Marlowe from the Irish Times newspaper. You said something that kind of haunts me as someone who's going to spend much of the next decade in Ireland. You said we're looking at 2 lost decades and possibly not a recovery to 2007 levels until 2020 or 2021. I know you're a very cautious and prudent commentator, but I would love to hear, one, is the Irish government doing the right thing right now? Do they have any choice? You talked about the balance between austerity and growth. Do you think they're hitting that balance right? And what kind of Ireland are we looking at over the next decade? If you could just tell us how you see that unfolding. Thanks.
Right. Yeah, I would say a couple things. First of all, the forecast of 2007 levels of output not coming back to 2021 is from an economist in Dublin, a guy named Konstantin Gurdjieff, whose work I admire. He teaches at Trinity, and he does some consulting and runs a blog called True Economics that's very useful, along with the Irish Economy blog, in following these things. So that could be right, that could be wrong, but I think it's illustrative of the scale of the challenge and of the blow that's been absorbed. As for the kind of Ireland that we're looking at, I go back to what I said about it not coming full circle. We're not back to the early 1980s. There are sort of similarities. Emigration is back up to its highest level since 1989. The number of Irish people, and I distinguish because there were a lot of Eastern Europeans who came in after 2004 to work on all these housing developments that no one really needs. They've largely gone home, not all of them, but they've largely gone home. But if you just look at the statistics on the number of Irish people who've left the country, it's doubled since 2008, and that's in the year to April. And the number of Irish people coming back which is the other part of the flow, of course, has fallen by about a third in the past couple of years. So emigration, sadly, has returned. I think there's some tough political skirmishing ahead. I don't think there. Ireland as a country, it seems to me, faces some pretty fundamental choices, and one of the issues that I think is out there has got to be political reform of some sort. You've got what to me as an outsider has been really interesting about looking at the Irish situation is the strangeness of the political cleavage, that you don't have the sort of typical left-right that you do in a European parliamentary system, or even here, where if somebody walks into the room and says, I'm a Republican, you've got a fair idea of what they think about a half a dozen issues. Same with a Democrat. If he comes in, you got a fair idea what he thinks about government spending, Social Security, etc. In Ireland, two guys could walk in, one from Fianna Fáil, one from Fine Gael. They could agree on 90% of the issues, or they could disagree on 90%. There's sort of no way of knowing. You look back. I found the history of the Progressive Democrats back in the 1980s kind of, again, interesting as a ideologically based or issues based political grouping that sort of comes out of nowhere as a rump elements of Fianna Fáil and others come together, and whatever you think about their policy preferences, they did stand for something. They came out and articulated it, and as a small party, actually made a pretty big difference in shaping Irish economic policy over the years. I think it's interesting that in the current climate, you haven't had something similar grow up where people would say, okay, here's an alternative policy, let's go this way, and we've got clean hands because we weren't at the wheel for the last 10 years. But maybe that'll come.
Do you have a follow-up on that?
The balance between austerity and growth, do they have to do these $6 billion in cuts?
Well,
right now?
Sorry?
Repeat the question.
Oh, the question was, again, the balance between austerity and growth. Does the Irish government actually have to do the $6 billion in cuts this year, or could they do less? Could they perhaps drag it out? It does seem to me, if you step back, what this is all aimed at is getting the budget deficit back down to 3% by 2014. Now, it was supposed to be 2013, and then the impossibility of that became apparent, so it became 2014. On the one hand, there's no real magic about 2014. I think the government has concluded, they've taken the temperature in Brussels and concluded, and they've taken the temperature of the markets and concluded that if they kick the can down the road again, they'll have no credibility at all. But this is where they're caught between a rock and a hard place, because saying you're going to do the impossible doesn't give you credibility, right? And so I think the problem is they're caught between saying, you know what, we can't do it by 2014. We just can't do it. We'll have blood in the streets. It's got to be 2016, or it's going to be 2017. And we promise, cross our heart, hope to die, it'll be 2017. All right, 2018 at the latest, right? And that would erode credibility. But saying I'm going to jump out the window and fly across the Washington Monument isn't very credible, whether I say I'm going to do it right now or later today. And so I think they're sort of caught on that.
I'm sorry, please go ahead.
I want to ask one last question. Do you think your understanding of this is different because you're an American, because you're looking at it from this distance? If you were an Irishman living in Ireland, would you have any different analysis than you do?
I suspect I probably would. I'm sure there are things that I don't understand about Ireland. I was always conscious as a foreign correspondent where I'd sort of drop into, whether I lived in China for 3 years. I wouldn't claim to know absolutely everything about China. I lived in London for almost 5 years. I wouldn't claim to know everything about the British system. So I was always conscious that I was an outsider, and I was always conscious that it's easy to misunderstand things or to incompletely understand things, and that's the cost of being an outsider. At the same time, I think the value of being an outsider, particularly in a case like this, is that the anger, whatever anger I have as an individual over the financial crisis, is directed at my own country, is directed inward, right? I moved back just in time to buy a house about a year before the peak, and for a long time I was convinced that the Federal Reserve had a chart somewhere, and I was a data point that showed, the actual peak of the housing bubble in the United States. Lynch buys his house in Virginia. So any anger I have about that's directed at myself or directed at my own country. I can look at Ireland, I think, as an interested outsider, as an outsider who, for personal reasons, regards Ireland with affection and has a great interest in its success. But my view, unlike I think, and I would not take away the anger. I think the Irish commentators who follow this and who've written about it, again, people like Fintan O'Toole, whose anger, scorches the page just about. I wouldn't disagree with the anger. I wouldn't say it's wrong. But I think, as in life in general, if you can put your anger aside for a moment and look at something clearly, perhaps my gaze isn't obscured by the anger. But whatever contribution I'm offering is just stacked up alongside folks who may know their own experience better than I do from an outsider. But so I would put it in that sort of balance.
We're about to have a debate here over how we should go about cutting, that is, following the austerity idea. And some people will say a dollar is a dollar is a dollar, kind of a Gertrude Stein approach to economics. Others will say, wait a minute, you want to maintain some of those key investments in the future. Has that been part of the Irish debate?
I'm not sure the extent to which it has yet. The cuts so far have been, and the cuts that are on the table are so deep. Again, they're taking. We've already had a couple of budgets of cuts. A year ago, December, I think was $4 billion. This December, they're talking about another $6 billion. It's $6 billion out of a $60 billion budget, right? So 10%. 10% of our federal spending would be over $300 billion. That's sort of the scale of what they're doing. So I don't think anything escapes that. I think the pain is going to be everywhere. Now, the Irish government has tried to focus on the future, if you will. The Taoiseach launched what's called the Innovation Fund Ireland, I think is Innovation Fund Ireland. Laura, is that something like that?
Global Irish Network, which they started.
Yeah. But this fund is meant to sort of encourage the VC community to come into Dublin a little bit more. So I think they're trying to keep an eye on that and trying to save a little bit of seed corn for it. But the cuts are real. These cuts are not the sort of tinkering around the margins that we tend to do sometimes, even in the current debate where people talk about, well, we're gonna take discretionary spending and we're gonna roll it back to this. But to do that, we're putting the Pentagon off the table, Social Security's off the table, Medicare's off the table, interest on the debt's off the table. But this part of the budget we're going to be very hard on. That's not what the Irish are doing. The Irish are really taking a meat cleaver to it.
Mm-hmm. Is there one last question? Well, please join me in a round of applause for a terrific presentation. Let me again strongly recommend this book. There's an opportunity to buy a copy outside, and I think David could be talked into making an autograph or two.
David could be talked into carrying it to your car for you if necessary.
And I do want to apologize for the use of the leprechaun phrase. I did not mean to in any way sully the culture-free volume here, but being of Welsh descent, I thought I could get away with it.
One cheap shot. Thanks for coming.